Right now, as you watch this video, there are probably a dozen conflicts happening around the world. Wars have been a constant companion to human civilization. We have fought over land, religion, resources, revenge, and sometimes just because someone looked at us funny. But what if I told you that for nearly 50 years, the two most powerful nations on Earth stared each other down, armed to the teeth with enough nuclear weapons to end all life on Earth, without firing a single shot at each other? Welcome to the Cold War, the strangest conflict in human history. A war where the superpowers didn't actually fight, everyone was always 2 minutes away from doom, and the entire world held its breath for 5 decades. So what was it? Why did it last so long? And how did we survive it? Let's find out. The origin, when the music stopped. To understand the Cold War, we need to go back to a basement in Leipzig, Germany, in May 1945. Soviet soldiers had just discovered something horrifying. The bodies of thousands of prisoners, victims of the Buchenwald concentration camp. The soldier who found them was so traumatized he had to be hospitalized. The Second World War was over in Europe. It had been the bloodiest conflict in human history. 60 million dead. Entire cities reduced to rubble. A continent in ruins. And the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, had won. Or had they? Here's the thing about winning a world war. You also win all the problems that caused it. And Europe in 1945 was absolutely drowning in problems. Economies were shattered, governments had collapsed, millions of people were displaced, and millions more were under military occupation. The United States and Great Britain looked at this mess and said, cool, we'll send some money and hope things figure themselves out, and then went home. The Soviet Union looked at the same mess and said, this is ours now. And here is where the story gets interesting. See, during the war, the Americans, the British, and the Soviets had been best friends. They shared intelligence, coordinated attacks, and even gave each other huge parties when things went well. Franklin Roosevelt really liked Joseph Stalin. Like, inappropriately liked him. Churchill was more suspicious, but he was outvoted. But here's what Roosevelt didn't realize. Stalin had his own agenda. And that agenda didn't involve democracy, free elections, or anything the West considered important. Stalin wanted security. He wanted buffer states between the Soviet Union and the West. He wanted to rebuild his country using German resources. And he absolutely did not want anyone interfering in his territory. So as the American and British forces pulled back, the Soviets moved in, and they didn't leave. By 1948, Europe was divided into two halves. The western half, occupied by America, Britain, and France, was democratic, capitalist, and rebuilding with American money. The eastern half, occupied by the Soviet Union, was communist, authoritarian, and being stripped bare for resources. And these two halves hated each other. Not liked each other, hated, with every fiber of their being. The Cold War had officially begun. The causes. Why couldn't we all just get along? Now you might be thinking, but surely these sophisticated, intelligent leaders could have found a compromise. They could have worked things out. What happened? Let me explain why compromise was never really on the table. First, there was ideology. The United States believed in democracy, free markets, and individual liberty. The Soviet Union believed in communism, state ownership of everything, and collective progress. These aren't just different opinions about tax policy. These are fundamentally incompatible worldviews. America looked at the Soviet Union and saw a totalitarian regime that imprisoned its own people, murdered its rivals, and crushed any dissent. The Soviet Union looked at America and saw an imperialist power that exploited workers, oppressed black citizens, and was only pretending to be the land of the free while actually being controlled by wealthy capitalists. Both sides had valid points, and both sides were absolutely convinced that the other side was evil and wanted to destroy them. Second, there was security. Stalin had learned some very hard lessons from history. Russia had been invaded by Germany twice in 30 years. Millions of Soviet citizens had died. There was no way in hell he was going to allow any foreign power to have influence on his borders ever again. Meanwhile, America looked to Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, which had historically been invaded by Russia, and thought, if we let the Soviets control this, they're just going to keep going. First Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, then who knows. Third, both sides had nukes. And we'll get to that in a minute. But trust me, the nuclear question changed everything. So by 1947, the divisions were complete. The West had the Marshall Plan, which was giving billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. The East had the Molotov Plan, which was basically the Soviet version, but without the money because the Soviets were broke. The West had NATO. The East had the Warsaw Pact. The West had democratic elections. The East had communist puppet governments that definitely were not puppet governments. And everyone was Armageddon level terrified of what might happen next. Mad, the best bad idea in history. Let's talk about the most terrifying concept in military strategy: mutual assured destruction, or MAD. I want you to imagine you're in middle school. There's a bully who hates you. And one day, you both discover that you each have a button that will destroy both of you instantly. If you push your button, he pushes his button, and you both die. If he pushes his button, you push yours, and you both die. The only way to survive is for neither of you to ever push the button. That is mad. And that is the foundation of global security for 40 years. Here's how it happened. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb. Before that, America had been the only country with nukes, which made them feel very confident and slightly invincible. Now, suddenly, they weren't alone. And worse, the Soviet Union had a lot more conventional troops in Europe. So if they invaded, America would have to decide: use nukes and kill millions of civilians, or don't use nukes and watch Western Europe become communist. Neither option was good. So some very smart people sat down and thought about this. They came to a terrifying conclusion. The only way to prevent nuclear war was to make sure no one could possibly win a nuclear war. If both sides had enough missiles to destroy each other completely, multiple times over, then neither side had any incentive to start a war, because the only outcome of starting a nuclear war is your own destruction. By the 1960s, the United States had roughly 30,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had about 10,000. Both could destroy each other many times over. There were enough nuclear weapons in the world to end human civilization several times over. American and Soviet missiles were pointed at each other 24 hours a day. Submarines lurked in the oceans, waited for the order to launch. Bombers circled the globe endlessly. The nuclear button was always inches away from someone's finger. And here's the bit that no one likes to talk about. It worked. For 45 years, the two most hostile nations on Earth, armed with weapons of unparalleled destruction, never fought each other directly. Not once. Was it because of MAD? Most historians say yes. The risk of total annihilation was so high that no rational actor would ever start a nuclear war. But rational actor is doing a lot of work there. Because there were moments we'll discuss soon, when rationality was in very short supply. The hottest Cold War. Key events. The Cold War was so cold because the two sides never fought each other directly. But it was plenty hot in other places. In fact, the superpowers fought proxy wars all over the world, turning developing nations into battlefields for their ideological competition. Here are the biggest ones. Berlin, the first crisis. In 1948, the Western Allies decided to merge their occupation zones in Germany into a new democratic country. This made a lot of sense economically. It was hard to rebuild when your country was split into 4 pieces, but it made Stalin very nervous. And he did what Stalin does when he is nervous. He lashed out. The Soviets blockaded West Berlin. All roads, all railways, all supply lines were cut off. 2 million West Berliners were now trapped behind Soviet lines, with no food, no fuel, no nothing. America's response? The Berlin airlift. For almost a year, American and British planes flew into West Berlin every single day, delivering supplies. 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and medicine. The Soviets watched on and did nothing, because shooting down a civilian supply plane would have been an act of war. The airlift succeeded, Berlin stayed free, and the world got its first taste of how the Cold War would work. Lots of tension, lots of brinkmanship, but nobody actually pulling the trigger. Korea, the first hot war. In 1950, communist forces from North Korea crossed the border into South Korea. Was this a Soviet plot, a Chinese plot, a North Korean initiative? The answer is all of the above, kind of. But America saw it as a test of their resolve. If they didn't push back, the logic went, the communists would keep advancing everywhere. So America sent troops. China sent troops too, on the other side. And for 3 years, they fought a brutal war that ended in a stalemate. The border between North and South Korea is basically where it started, and it's still there today. The Korean War taught both superpowers a valuable lesson. Direct conflict between America and the communist China was extremely dangerous and didn't accomplish much. So they kept competing, but carefully, very carefully, until 1962. Cuba, 13 days. This is it, the moment when the world came closest to nuclear war, and it started because someone made a really, really bad decision. Here's what happened. Fidel Castro had just overthrown the American-backed dictator in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution was complete, and Castro, being a committed communist, did what communists do. He aligned with the Soviet Union. This made President Kennedy angry, not because of anything Castro did, but because Cuba was now a Soviet ally, 90 miles away from Florida. So Kennedy did what American presidents do when they're angry. He authorized a plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The plan was called the Bay of Pigs, and it failed, spectacularly. The invasion force was crushed, the leaders were captured, and Kennedy looked like an idiot on the world stage. To make up for this embarrassment, Kennedy's advisors came up with a new idea. What if America installed nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet border? That would threaten the Soviet Union directly. The Soviets' response was predictable. If America was putting missiles in Turkey, they would put missiles in Cuba. Same thing, different location. So now American soil was within nuclear range, and nobody knew what to do about it. For 13 days, in October 1962, the world held its breath. American naval ships surrounded Cuba. Soviet ships carrying more missiles approached the blockade. Soviet commanders in Cuba had nuclear weapons and local authority to use them if America invaded. Kennedy and his advisors sat in the White House, trying to figure out what to do. Options included bombing the missile sites, invading Cuba, or doing nothing. All of them had potential catastrophic consequences. The breakthrough came through a back-channel communication. Kennedy agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. Neither side wanted to admit this publicly, so they lied about it afterward. the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The world was safe. Barely. Afterward, both sides realized they had come way too close to annihilation, so they established a hotline between Washington and Moscow. They started talking more. They signed agreements to limit nuclear testing. For a few years, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Cold War might thaw. The Iron Curtain, life in the shadow. Before we continue, let's talk about what the Cold War actually felt like for regular people. Because the big events make for great stories, but the everyday reality was its own kind of nightmare. If you lived in Western Europe or America during the Cold War, you lived with a background level of fear that younger people today can barely imagine. Every night, the news showed footage of Soviet tanks, Soviet soldiers, and Soviet missiles. Every school had nuclear fallout drills, where children would hide under their desks. Because apparently a wooden desk can protect you from a nuclear explosion. Parents built fallout shelters in their basements. Governments distributed pamphlets about surviving nuclear war. Rock bands wrote songs about atomic apocalypse. The threat of nuclear annihilation was everywhere, all the time. And for the people in the communist countries, it was worse. Much worse. In the Soviet Union and its satellite states, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, life was characterized by scarcity, suspicion, and surveillance. The secret police, the Stasi in East Germany, the KGB in the Soviet Union, watched everyone. They had informants in every building, every workplace, every apartment complex. You could be arrested for saying the wrong thing. You could lose your job for having the wrong friends. Entire families were destroyed because someone made an offhand comment about the government. And yet people lived. They fell in love, they raised children, they found joy where they could. In the Soviet Union, there was a saying, they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. Humor was a survival mechanism. Irony was armor. In East Germany, there was a saying too, we are the richest poor people in the world. Because compared to genuine poverty, communist countries provided healthcare, housing, and education. But compared to the West, they had nothing. Empty grocery stores, old cars, grey apartment blocks. And separating it all was the border. Not just any border. The most fortified, militarized, deadly border in human history. And before we look at that border, let's have a quick break. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the Cold War, make sure you subscribe to What Is and hit that notification bell. We've got more videos just like this coming soon. Now let's get back to the story. The Wall, the beginning of the end. On August 13th, 1961, East German authorities woke up to find their country was being walled off. Overnight, without warning, they started building a barrier through the middle of Berlin. It was called the Berlin Wall, and it was presented as a protective measure against Western fascists. But everyone knew what it really was, a prison wall. For decades, East Germans had been fleeing to West Germany through Berlin. It was easy. Walk across the border, take a subway, and suddenly you were in a free country. Between 1949 and 1961, 2.5 million East Germans left. That's about 15% of the population. The brain drain was catastrophic. So the East German government, with Soviet approval, built a wall. First it was barbed wire, then concrete. Then it became a massive structure, 96 miles long, 12 feet high, with guard towers, watchdogs, and guards who had orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. And it worked. People stopped leaving. But they also started hating the government with a fury that would eventually bring the whole system down. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall stood as the most visible symbol of the Cold War. Families were separated, friends lost touch, people died trying to cross it. Here's the irony. By building the wall, the Soviet Union accidentally stabilized its own empire. East Germany became more prosperous than other Soviet satellite states. The wall prevented the exodus that might have triggered the collapse. For a while, it looked like the Cold War might last forever. And then, in the 1980s, everything changed. The reckoning. Why did it end? In 1979, the Soviet Union made a decision that would ultimately destroy them. They invaded Afghanistan. This was supposed to be a quick intervention, like when America went into Vietnam. You know, a quick operation, the locals will welcome us, we'll be out in a few months. It didn't go that way at all. The Afghan Mujahideen, funded and armed by America, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, fought back with incredible ferocity. The Soviets found themselves in a quagmire. 10 years, 15,000 Soviet dead, billions of dollars spent, and absolutely nothing to show for it. The war drained Soviet resources, exposed their military weaknesses, and created a generation of angry, battle-hardened Islamic extremists who would later turn against America. But at the time, the most important impact was economic. The Soviet economy was already struggling. Running an empire, maintaining a massive military, and now paying for a losing war in Afghanistan, it was too much. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was essentially bankrupt. And then, in 1985, a new Soviet leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was young, energetic, and absolutely horrified by what his country had become. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet system was broken, the economy was stagnant, the military was overextended, the population was losing faith. So he introduced two revolutionary ideas: glasnost, which meant openness and transparency, and perestroika, which meant restructuring and reform. He also decided to stop trying to compete with America on military spending. The arms race was killing the Soviet economy, and he knew it. What Gorbachev didn't anticipate: once you open the door to reform, you can't control where it leads. In 1989, as Gorbachev relaxed Soviet control over Eastern Europe, the satellite states began to revolt. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. East Germans started demonstrating by their hundreds of thousands. On November 9th, 1989, an East German official made a mistake. He announced that East Germans could cross the border immediately, without paperwork. He was supposed to say, starting tomorrow, but he got confused, and he said immediately. Within hours, thousands of East Germans were streaming through the border crossings. The people were dancing on the Berlin Wall. Hammers and chisels came out. Within weeks, the wall was torn down. The Cold War was over. Not with a nuclear explosion, not with a world war, but with a mistake and a celebration. The aftermath. What came next? On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for one last time. What had been the world's largest country broke apart into 15 different nations. America had won the Cold War. The Berlin Wall was a museum piece. Democracy was spreading. The nuclear threat was fading. The world was entering a new era of American hegemony and global cooperation. And then, in 2001, terrorists flew planes into the World Trade Center, and we realized that the old certainties were gone. The Cold War had given us a simple framework: us versus them, democracy versus communism, good versus evil. When that framework collapsed, we had to find a new one, and we're still searching. The aftermath also left behind some uncomfortable legacies. America, flushed with victory, became overconfident. We invaded Iraq based on faulty intelligence. We ignored rising powers. We assumed that democracy would naturally spread everywhere, and when it didn't, we got frustrated. Russia, humiliated by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaos that followed, eventually found a new leader, Vladimir Putin. And Putin's entire political project has been about restoring Russian greatness, about getting revenge for the humiliation of the 1990s, which is why Ukraine is at war today, and why the relationship between Russia and the West is once again hostile. The Cold War didn't really end, it just changed shape. Lessons. What did we learn? So what have we learned from the Cold War? Are we smarter now? Would we handle things different? Here's a few lessons for whatever they're worth. First, nuclear weapons are terrifying, but they might also prevent major wars between great powers. Since 1945, there has been no direct conflict between the major powers, not one. For the first time in humanity's history, the great powers have gone almost 80 years without fighting each other. Is this because of nuclear weapons? Maybe. Is it worth the risk? That's a question we're still trying to answer. Second, ideologies make terrible neighbors. Democracy and communism were fundamentally incompatible worldviews. They couldn't coexist peacefully. But here's the thing. Lots of other ideologies are also fundamentally incompatible. Religious extremism, national authoritarianism, tribalism. These can be just as dangerous. The Cold War didn't prove that democracy always wins. It proved that when two groups believe they have the monopoly on truth, conflicts can last for decades. Third, proxy wars are terrible for everyone involved. The Cold War's proxy conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan killed millions of people and destroyed entire societies. The superpowers used these countries as testing grounds for their weapons and ideologies, then abandoned them to whatever was convenient. We've been doing the same thing in the Middle East and elsewhere. It's past time to stop. Fourth, economic pressure works. The Soviet Union collapsed partly because it couldn't keep up with Western economic productivity. Sanctions, isolation, and economic competition eventually broke the system. That's why China's approach, integrating with the global economy while maintaining authoritarian control, is so interesting. They're trying to have the best of both worlds. Whether it works long term remains to be seen. Fifth, and maybe most importantly, we survived. For 45 years, we lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Every day we woke up knowing that it might be the last day, and we kept going. We fell in love, we built things, we made art, we raised families. Humanity faced its darkest fears and looked them straight in the eye, and we didn't blink. The Cold War was terrifying. It was absurd. It was humanity's most dangerous moment, but we got through it. And that is the Cold War. 45 years of tension, fear, absurd brinkmanship, and unexpected humanity. A conflict where the weapons could end all life on Earth, but were never used. Where the two sides hated each other so much, but learned to coexist. Where ordinary people found joy in the shadows of nuclear apocalypse. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The choices we make now will determine whether the next chapter is a tragedy or a comedy. Let's try and make it a comedy. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to What Is and watch our other deep dives into history's most fascinating topics. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the Cold War. Check out one of our other videos. There'll be one linked on screen. We cover all subjects, including history, science, music, and the natural world. Anything you can ask, What Is? See you next time.